Hello, in this video I'll show you how I made this light display shadow box based on a kayaker on a lake. The kayaker is my husband, and this is inspired by a vacation we took to upstate New York shortly after getting married. I have a couple other videos where I go really in-depth on how to create images to load into Cricut Design Space, so for this video I'm just going to start in Cricut Design Space. I've already loaded all the elements for the light display shadow box into Cricut Design Space. These elements are a mix of some that I created myself and a mix of some that I found online. I'll link some other videos here and in the comments below if you want to see more detail on how to create these elements to load into Cricut. I'm starting on the bottom half of my template layers first, so I've loaded in rocks, seagrasses, fish, and some waves. I'll also tag a video here on how to create the paper templates that each of these elements are going to be welded to. Once you have this template created, you can save it and use it for multiple different projects. I start adding to these templates by working with the rocks first. So I just finished the first layer where I placed different rocks around the bottom edges of the template. I move the rocks around in different positions until I find a design that I like. For the back layer, after I had found the design that I liked, I welded everything together. Then I bring the next forwardmost template layer on top of this layer that I just completed. I work from the back layer to the forwardmost layer to make sure that the back layer has the largest features to create the shadows and depth that we need. I try to avoid any repeat patterns so that the rocks will look random like they would in nature. I'm also thinking about where I might place the grass and the fish once we have all of the rocks done to make sure that I'm not filling too much space now. Once I have this layer completed, I use the same process to complete the next two forwardmost layers. Here you can see how all four layers look stacked against each other. Then I split the four layers apart so that I can start adding the underwater grasses. Again, I'm working from back to front. One extra layer of complexity while designing the grasses is making sure that we consider what the Cricut can actually cut. I'm paying attention to how thin the grasses are and how well they'll connect to the rocks. If the grasses are too thin or aren't connected well enough to the paper around them, one of two things can happen. First, the Cricut might not be able to actually cut it very well. It could drag and tear the paper instead of creating a nice clean cut. Second, even if the Cricut is able to cut it out, the paper might not be strong enough to support its own weight. If I leave a really long and skinny piece of grass, it's liable to bend. I'll be spacing the individual layers apart to create the desired shadow effect, so there won't be a lot of support between the layers. Because of this, each layer needs to stand upright on its own. When I'm choosing an element to work with, I copy and paste it from all of the options that are on the right side. This allows me to use each piece of grass more than once if I want, and if I size it poorly, I can restart with the copy from the right. Once I have each layer designed in a way that I like, I weld the elements together. To weld them together while I'm still showing the layers behind it, I simply hide all of the layers that I'm not working on. Then I can highlight the current layer and the elements alone without welding things to back layers. Next, I start working on the waves. To do this, I'm using different elements that I've loaded into Cricut Design Space. I use the flip feature and different sizing options to create random patterns within the waves. Then I weld that layer together. I want my kayaker to be on the second layer from the front. So once I have the back two layers completed, I bring the third template layer up and bring the kayaker on top of it too. Because I won't have any back support for the kayaker, it needs to be really securely attached to the paper around it. Because of this, I'm paying attention to where I'm connecting the waves to the kayaker to make sure that it gives really good support. I still need to have gaps between the water so it looks like ripples or waves on top of the surface, but on this layer, the gaps need to be a little bit smaller than on other layers so that it can support the full weight of the kayaker. I use the slice tool to pick out pieces of the waves that I want to use to connect to the kayaker. Once I have the water and the kayaker connected in a way that I like and think will be strong, I attach them together. Then I unhide the backward layers to see how the kayaker fits over the water lines behind him. I make adjustments to make sure that everything is lining up well, and then weld the kayaker to the current layer of the template. Then I finish the forwardmost layer and center everything together. Next, I insert a box that will be 7.9 by 4 inches. This will be a blank piece of paper that will cover the very back layer. I'm going to cut out fish images from this back layer to make it look like we have some really far away fish swimming. But before I start with any of the fish, I want to add some underwater ripples. This should look like water that's being stirred around because of the kayaker paddling. I use the same thought process in terms of where I'm going to be placing the ripples. However, instead of welding things together, this time I will be slicing the ripples out of this image. I briefly turn this square into a score line so that I can see the kayaker and all the layers behind it to make sure that I'm putting the ripples in the right spot. Once I have the ripples the way that I want them to be, I drag the kayaker template away and turn the box back to a basic cut. Then I attach all of the ripples together and slice them out of the rectangle. I made some slices and some welds to make the very top edge of this box match the very back layer of the water ripples, but after I added some trees and some other features to the top half of the box, I ended up changing this anyways, so that's why I'm not showing how I made this. Instead, I start lining up some fish over this back template. I'm lining the fish up to create a design that I like, and then once I have this set up, I'll slice them out and delete it, so it actually shows an open hole where the fish are. Once I've decided that these are the fishing groups that I want to use, I take everything off of this layer and put the very backmost layer in front of this piece of paper. Then I locate the fish on this very back piece, making sure that I can still see them around the rocks and grass that we've already added to the template. I do want some of the fish to look like they're swimming behind the rocks, so I know that half of them are going to disappear. Then I attach the fish together and slice them out of the very back rectangle. Now when I align the bottom, you can see the holes of the fish on this layer. Now I start inserting some fish into the forwardmost template layers. Just as with the grass, the fish need to be well supported so that they won't bend. After I have a fish in a place that I like it, I weld it to the template. Adding fish into these forward template layers was one of my favorite parts of this whole design because it's really fun to look through and try and find where the hiding fish are. Once I have my fish done, it's finally time to start working on the top half of the design. I insert some elements to look like the very back shorelines of the lake. I'm only going to have shoreline on the very back 2 layers. Then I insert some pine trees onto these layers. Once the pine trees are set, I need to cover up any of the straight lines from the template. The shoreline shouldn't be a perfectly straight line, so I use some of the ragged edges from the rocks to make this shoreline look random. I want the very forwardmost layer of the design to have some scraggly edges from pine trees around it. To do this, I insert some of the pine tree images just over the top half of the design. I use the slice tool to clean up anything that hangs out over the outer edges of the design, and then I repeat the same with the other side of the template, and then also across the top border. Once I like how the top border looks, I weld it together too. Next, I wanted to create some ripples off of the very back shoreline of the lake. To do this, I used some of the random edges from the waves that I had used earlier and lined them up against the shoreline. Then I welded it together. Finally, I wanted to add some underwater ripples to the very back layer. To do this, I first had to weld a little more height onto this piece of paper so that the layer reached to the shoreline. Then I still used the random edges from our wave elements and lined it up to the shoreline. Once I had it in a position that looked good, I sliced it out from the very back piece of paper. After deleting the extras, you can see the hole that's left. Finally, I bring all 5 layers together and center them. Here's what the final design looks like. Now I center these 5 layers with my paper frame so that I can size everything to my shadow box. I undersize the center 4 layers just slightly so that it'll fit within the paper frame. Then I measure the internal dimensions of my shadow box. Now I insert a square into Cricut Design Space equal to those dimensions. This was 7.6 inches. Then I size all of my layers to fit this box. Now I save the project and click Make It. I want to cut the very bottom of the box first to make sure that it fits within my shadow box correctly. Once I make sure that the sizing is right, then I continue cutting all of the rest of the layers. To make the outer paper box, I fold along the scored edges. Then I use hot glue to glue the tabs into place. I make the top and bottom the same way, and then I fit the top piece over the bottom piece. Here you can see the finished paper box. When one layer is finished cutting, I remove that mat and replace it with another mat. Then I weed this first mat while the second mat is cutting. I discard the large pieces of paper that I don't need first, and then I remove the actual template layer very carefully without bending it. Then I use a combination of the weeding tool, tweezers, and an X-Acto knife to remove all of the small pieces of paper from the design. I prefer to set the face of the design down on the work table and remove these pieces out of the back so that if there's any burrs on the edges of the paper, they won't show on the front of the design. I also cut foam strips to use as spacers while the paper is cutting. I cut these about 1/4 of an inch in width, and I use a ruler to try and keep straight lines. Finally, once all of the paper is cut and weeded and the foam strips are ready, I start assembling the paper package. I work from the backmost layer forward, and I glue the foam strips onto the top of the paper. I try and place the foam strips as close to the edge as possible. I glue 4 foam strips per piece of paper. The foam strips that I use have a sticky backing, so I peel the backing off when I'm gluing these strips down. For the 4th foam strip, I leave the sticky backing on and glue the other side face down. Then I peel the sticky backing off, leaving the sticky side up. I get my next layer to add to the paper package and line it up with the edges. Then I stick it in place, sticking it to this foam strip. What I like about using the sticky foam strip is that I have the ability to pull this layer off and reposition it if it's not in line. I do this before I put any hot glue on this layer. The foam strip is better because if I had to hot glue this layer, I would be very limited in time to get everything to line up before the glue set. Once I have this layer in line, I go back through and hot glue each of the 4 foam strips. I repeat this same process until I have all 4 paper layers glued together to create the paper package. Here is the completed paper package. The very back half layer with our fish cutouts I don't use a spacer for, so I just lay it behind the paper package in the shadow box. Before I finish assembling the shadow box, I clean the inside with alcohol and a lint-free rag to remove any smears or dust. Once it's dry, I place the paper package into the shadow box. Then I add LED strip lights into the shadow box. There should be enough room that you can add the strip lights to the remaining edges of the frame behind your paper package. The LEDs that I like to use have a sticky backing, so I take this paper off and use the sticky side to stick it directly to the frame. Then I rotate the LED strip lights face down so that the LED lights will shine into the shadow box. I keep it as close to the edge as possible where we have multiple layers of paper stacked up so that the individual lights won't shine through all the paper, but you'll get the general blur effect. I tape the lights into place so that they'll stay secure. Then I plug the power cord into our LED light strip and tape that into place. Now I cut the bottom right corner out of the back frame for the shadow box so that the power cord can come out. Then I turn the locking tabs so that the back of the frame is secure. And here is our completed light display shadow box. I'll link the description for the LED lights that I purchased in the comments below. I love these because they come with so many different color options. Thanks for watching this video on how I made a light display shadow box of a kayaker on a lake. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.